This is Carrie Schell from On Point Quilter. For week 2, we will be designing a border using Electric Quilt. Don't worry if you don't have Electric Quilt, however, because you will be able to use this border and still piece it with the techniques I will share with you next week. When we finished part 1 of the Elsa and Anna quilt, we talked about using the panel and importing it into EQ. We also talked about selecting a palette of fabrics to work with. And so now we're ready to use that palette and to design a border for the quilt. So right now there's actually a 1-inch border around the whole quilt, and it is 30 by 36, which actually that's a pretty good number. I look for numbers that are at least divisible by 2. So when I add borders, I have a little bit easier time getting blocks to standard sizes. So I'm going to go to the Borders tab, and now I'm going to add another border, and I'm going to use the tile squares. And the reason I like tile squares is it makes all of the blocks square, which obviously is something that is useful from a quilting perspective. Now, if you look at this, however, the blocks look really big in regards to the center panel. So I'm going to just bring up the number of horizontal blocks. One of the things I'm also looking for is if I can get rid of this extra added border on the one side, which is what, if your quilt is not square, is something that you have to deal with. And right now the blocks are 7.5 inches, still probably a little bit big, so I'm going to go up to 5 blocks horizontal. I've gotten rid of that spacer border, and now all of the blocks are 6 inches, which that's a really nice size, so I'm going to stick with that. Okay, so now that I've got the layout, now I need to design some shapes to fill in the block. And again, I'm trying to find something that I can do relatively easily, because this is for a niece, and I don't think real complex borders would necessarily enhance the panel. So I'm going to just go and I'm going to work on block, and one of the things that I thought about was some diamonds, because they sort of have that crystal look, and I think that would be in keeping with the design. So I can do that using Easy Draw. So block, new block, Easy Draw, and it is set to 6 by 6, which is exactly what I need for my block. I love using 24 by 24. I always look for something that's a multiple of the 6. So 6 times 4 is 24, which means everything will snap to 1/4 inch. And then on my graph paper cells, I'm going to move those to 6 by 6 as well. Okay, so my snapping options are snap to grid points on the work table, which is what I also want to have selected. So I'm going to start by cutting the block in half, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually create 2 diamonds. And you can just drag your pencil to fill that in, and you can see that I'm going to the 1.5 point. Oh, and I think I made a mistake here. I went a little bit beyond the 3 point. Probably would have been easier if I had turned the graph paper cells on, and I could have checked that out. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to pick up this node, and I'm going to just move those over to the correct place. So very easy to fix, and do that just with the shape tool. So going back to the line tool, now that I've got some of the grid lines here, this is just a little bit easier to see where I need to go. Okay, so to color, I'm just going to put a couple of pinks in the center, And I'm going to put some of the blues in the outside of the diamond. So I will now add that to the sketchbook. I'm also going to create one additional new block, and I'd like to just do a square within a square. So I can still stay with the 6x6 grid, again using the line tool, and I'll just go to all of these, basically 3 points. So I'm going to color that. And again, use a pink in the center. And for the outside of this, I'm going to just use the spray can tool, and I can turn all of the corners blue at once. And I'm going to add that to the sketchbook as well. So now I'm going to go back using the work table to work on the quilt. Now I have played with this a bit and decided I do want to have just some plain squares so I can play with some different quilting designs, but I thought because I have different numbers along the borders than on the top, I would put some of the diamonds on, put 4 diamonds on the sides and then 3 sets of diamonds on the top. I'm going to select the rotate block, and I'm just going to rotate each of these. And then for the corners, I'm going to use the square in the square block. And then if I use my paintbrush tool, and if I do the control and hit that inner border, it will all become sort of that maroon. And now I can just use the paintbrush tool and paint the blank squares. And I am going to want to change some of the other ones here, because just to have a little bit more variation, because since I purchased all these different pinks, I want to make sure that I'm using them all. So you can play with this a bit, and I will continue to do that. But I've now designed an easy border for my quilt, and I could also go back and add another border, and I'm just going to make this a 1/2 inch, and then I've got a binding, and I think for binding I may just use that dark blue. So once I've done that, I can add to sketchbook, and now I'm ready to start piecing. Next week I will be providing a tutorial on piecing the diamond blocks and the square in a square blocks. Thanks so much for watching.